Back in the early years of the last century, when the rage for world order, world federalism, and world government was in full bloom amongst the literati, the glitterati, the Illuminati, and the just plain naughty, there were a few clear minds and fearless voices that attacked these benighted ideas with courage, with wit and sanity. One of the most brilliant and irrepressible of those minds and voices belonged to Gilbert Keith Chesterton, the inimitable British poet, essayist, novelist, historian, philosopher, editor, debater, and Christian apologist. This cheerful and pugnacious warrior skewered the liberal shibboleths of his day with a delightful verve and a profound insight. G.K. Chesterton would have no trouble at all in seeing the noxious and tyrannical one-world design behind the facade of free trade at events such as this weekend's so-called Summit of the Americas in Quebec. Allow me to share with you this Chesterton gem, one of my favorites, the reason why will become obvious, entitled The World's State. Oh, how I love humanity, with a love so pure and Pringlish, and oh, how I hate the horrid French who never will be English. The international idea, the largest and the clearest, is welding all the nations now, except the one that's nearest. This compromise has long been known, this scheme of partial pardons, in ethical societies and small suburban gardens, the villas and the chapels where I learned with little labor the way to love my fellow man and hate my next door neighbor. And to G.K. Chesterton, we offer humble apologies for our poor mimicry in this crude doggerel by W.F. Jasperton entitled One World über Alles. Oh, wondrous time to be alive, the era of globalization. Nationhood has made a mess, now time for harmonization. Time now for great grand visions and elevating talk of glorious free trade agreements and building block by block the mirthful world of love and peace without pain or war or border. Some say it is utopia, this shining new world order. Come now on pious bended knee to worship with oblations upon the pagan altars of our beloved United Nations, with NGOs and IGOs and global civil society, with terrorists and tyrants of infinite variety. For our plans are good and wise and sure, the benefits are legion. This heaven won't come overnight, but we're building in your region. Listen not to foolish wags who warn danger and disaster. Come, lift your chains and lick the hands of your tender, fearful master. Most of you, no doubt, have watched some of the television news or read newspapers over the past couple of days concerning the goings-on in Quebec, Canada. There we have President George W. Bush meeting with the heads of 33 other nations of the Western Hemisphere for the ostensible purpose of forming a free trade area of the Americas, the FTAA. This FTAA is an expansion of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Area, from the current 3 members, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, to include all countries of the hemisphere from, as former President Bush said, quote, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, end quote. Wonderful benefits will accrue to everyone concerned, the FTAA architects promise. Open borders and free movement of people, products, and capital will bring a rising tide of prosperity that will lift all boats, they say. We see familiar summit sites of presidents, prime ministers, economic ministers, corporate CEOs, and bankers clinking glasses and toasting new victories for free markets. Free markets, they say. Alongside these scenes, we see other familiar sights less cordial. Marching, chanting, defiant demonstrators clashing with police. We see tear gas, riots, fires, violence, and anarchy. We see an odd melange of slogans and banners mixing defense of national sovereignty with typical Marxist slogans. We've seen all of this before. at the infamous battle in Seattle against the World Trade Organization, the WTO. This was repeated a few months after that at the IMF World Bank Conference in Washington, D.C., then at the IMF meeting in Prague in the Czech Republic, and the European Summit in Nice, France. It's a familiar formula we've seen over and over. And there is a connection there that we will be getting into momentarily. What is actually going on here? What is this new FTAA? What does it portend for us as American citizens? What kind of future does it hold for our children and grandchildren, should it come to be? What are the real consequences that will flow from a realization of the plans proposed and already set in motion by the proponents of this so-called free trade area? And then, who are these opponents of the FTAA, and what are they after? Don't think that you will find the true answers to these and other similarly important questions on CNN, CBS, PBS, ABC, or in the pages of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, or Newsweek. The people who run these so-called news organizations have no more intention of providing you with the facts and truth than do the communist editors in the China People's Daily in Beijing or Soviet Izvestia in Moscow. Yes, they still call it Soviet Izvestia. Their purpose is to create a booming, buzzing confusion that will distract public attention from the ongoing efforts of the one world managerial elites constructing the global New World Order. Many of you no doubt recognize that phrase, booming, buzzing confusion, from an important article authored by Columbia University law professor and veteran State Department official Richard N. Gardner, Clinton's ambassador to Spain. The article was entitled The Hard Road to World Order, and it appeared in the April 1974 issue of Foreign Affairs, a journal which Time magazine calls the most important, influential periodical in print. The influence of Foreign Affairs derives, of course, from the fact that it is the official House organ of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. The Hard Road article began with CFR member Richard Gardner's lamentation that like-minded internationalists had failed to achieve what he termed instant world government. He proposed a new and more effective route to a creation of an all-powerful global superstate, asserting in that article, quote, "In short, the House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James' famous description of reality, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault." Yes, the great booming, buzzing confusion you see today in Quebec is smokescreen to mask this bottom-up construction of world order through regional blocs. However, do not be confused by this. This bottom-up effort is directed from the top down. The top in this case, as in so many other cases, comes from Pratt House, the CFR headquarters in New York City. Like the slime trail that leads to a slug, virtually every trail of American foreign policy disasters leads back to the Council on Foreign Relations. There is no longer reason for any sensible American to doubt that the CFR coterie intends to take us down the same suicidal path that Europe is now traveling. The one world architects of the European Monetary Union are openly advocating an American monetary union, as we learn in the pages of Foreign Affairs. Words fail to convey the enormity and the audacity of this colossal, dangerous fraud which we are witnessing. And we are seeing it in this current spontaneous, quote-unquote, movement to transform the Western Hemisphere into a carbon copy of the increasingly tyrannical European Union. But even that grim prospect of an America under a EU-style, centrally controlled economic bloc does not begin to convey the seriousness of the peril we face if we allow these plans to succeed. Regional integration by the insiders of this one world conspiracy, and yes, we use the C word, conspiracy, is for total unrestrained power on a planetary scale. That is the real objective. Ladies and gentlemen, we aren't engaging in wild speculation here. The FTAA architects have in various places revealed their plans. You may recall the memorable scene in the movie Patton, where George C. Scott, in the title role, victoriously exclaims, "Rommel, you magnificent blankety-blank, I read your book." Well, he didn't actually say blankety-blank in the movie, you understand, but the point is, Patton had read Rommel's book. Thus he knew what to expect from his enemy. Fellow freedom fighters, the enemies of freedom have also written books revealing their plans and their strategies. We have read their books. This is one of them. Western Hemispheric Economic Integration, a 1994 study by Gary Clyde Hufbauer, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, former CFR Vice President, and Jeffrey J. Schott. This study is one of a number of reports produced to coincide not with this Summit of the Americas, but the 1994 Summit of the Americas in Miami. Perhaps you've forgotten about that event. The New American was almost alone in exposing that event for the launch pad that has brought us to the current happenings in Quebec. Allow us to share just a couple of passages from this important study, which remains almost completely unknown to most Americans, but has played a great role in the culmination of those events which we now see in Quebec. Let us begin with the book's dedication. The authors say, "To David Rockefeller for his lifelong devotion to promoting economic development in Latin America and to improving relations among the countries of the Western Hemisphere. His wisdom has been an enormous source of encouragement to the work of the Institute and inspired us to explore the important ties that unite the Americas." End quote. This dedication was appropriate since the Summit of the Americas in Miami, where the 34-nation free trade area of the Americas, FTAA, was launched, was completely a Rockefeller show from start to finish. The summit and the FTAA were conceived, nurtured, and brought to fruition by the Council of the Americas. David Rockefeller was founder and honorary chairman. By the Americas Society, David Rockefeller, chairman. By the Forum for the Americas, David Rockefeller, founder. By the U.S. Council of Mexico-U.S. Business Committee, Rodman C. Rockefeller, chairman. The Council on Foreign Relations, and David Rockefeller, former chairman. The Trilateral Commission, David Rockefeller, founder and honorary chairman. And the Chase Manhattan Bank, David Rockefeller, former chairman. The Hufbauer-Schott book was published by the Institute for International Economics, or the IIE. According to the London Observer, the IIE, quote, may be the most influential think tank on the planet. The executive director of the IIE is, surprise, U.S. former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, C. Fred Bergston, member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. The complete interlock between the CFR and the IIE is further demonstrated by the list of IEE officers and directors provided in the study itself. The IIE's chairman is listed as Peter G. Peterson, who is also chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. He succeeded David Rockefeller in that position. If you watch on the news over these last several days, you'll see that the IIE's Fred Bergston, who shepherded this study through, is one of the most frequently seen experts in the establishment media, commenting on the current situation in Quebec and the need to push forward on the fast track with President Bush and the Congress for the FTAA. But back to the report. The report states that, quote, after 4 decades of dedicated effort, Western Europe has just arrived at the threshold of monetary union and fiscal coordination. It seems likely that trade and investment integration will proceed at a faster pace in the Western Hemisphere. The study goes on to then advocate exactly that and to explain how they can compress in a very short time what took 4 decades to accomplish with the European Union. And they intend to move forward with that on a very rapid pace. Remember, this was back in 1994. The same one world folks were riding high after pushing through NAFTA at that time, the fast track for NAFTA. Henry Kissinger, a member of the Executive Committee of the Trilateral Commission and a longtime power in the Council on Foreign Relations, called the vote on NAFTA the single most important decision that Congress would make during Mr. Clinton's first term. Indeed, Kissinger was fairly open in acknowledging this in the Los Angeles Times when he said that passage, quote, will represent the most creative step toward a new world order taken by any group of countries since the end of the Cold War, end quote. He went on to say that NAFTA, quote, is not a conventional trade agreement, but the architecture of a new international system. And what is that international system? Henry Kissinger is not one to be exhilarated by dry economics, but at the potential concentration of power. David Rockefeller, Kissinger's superior among the trilaterals and CFR coterie, went so far as to say in the Wall Street Journal that he didn't, quote, think that criminal would be too strong a word to describe to rejecting NAFTA. According to Rockefeller, he said, quote, everything is in place after 500 years to build a true new world in the Western Hemisphere, end quote. Now again, this was following NAFTA. The FTAA is a further step in this movement toward a new world order. Another proponent at the time, Andrew Reading of the New School for Social Research and the Brookings Institute, conceded that the passage of NAFTA is, quote, an incipient form of international government that would signal the formation, however tentatively, of a new political unit, North America, end quote. Now, this is not idle speculation, for as Reading suggested, quote, with economic integration will come political integration, end quote. And we see this theme, this expression over and over again. The insiders of the One World movement recognize that economic integration is essential to then bringing about political integration. Representative Robert Matsui, Liberal Democrat congressman from California, another NAFTA supporter, candidly admitted that the agreement brings with it a surrender of, quote, American independence. Now you know why he was appointed by Republican President George W. Bush and why he is playing such a central role now in pushing this new free trade area of the Americas. Not long after the Miami summit, I attended another One World confab, this one the Gorbachev State of the World Forum in San Francisco. One of the keynote speakers there was Zbigniew Brzezinski. You recall him? Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, President Carter's National Security Advisors. He stated in his keynote address to the Gorbachev Forum, quote, we cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for eventual globalization, genuine globalization, is progressive regionalization, because thereby we move toward larger, more stable, more cooperative units. Yes, we've read their books, we've read their journals and speeches, we've attended their conferences. We have no hesitancy to declare that these are our enemies. They are the enemies of national sovereignty, the enemies of independence and the Constitution and the rule of law, the enemies of freedom and of Christianity and of biblical morality. They are plotting the same path now that they trod in the tricking of the nations of Europe into the deadly trap known as the European Union. In our recent issue of the New American Magazine, we've given an abridged, a more in-depth treatment of all of this, taken from the new book, The United Nations Exposed. And we show in there that the people of Europe were told repeatedly when they were first entering into what was the formation, the early formation of the European Union in 1951, that there was no danger whatsoever of loss of sovereignty. A few years ago, Sir Peregrine Westhorn wrote in the London Sunday Telegraph, 20 years ago, when the process began, there was no question of losing sovereignty. That was a lie, at any rate, a dishonest obfuscation. Further, said Westhorn, For the past 20 years or so, anybody wanting to have a career in the public service in the higher reaches of the city or the media has had to be pro-European. In the privacy of the closet or among the close friends, even many Federalists would admit as much. But such is the momentum behind the European movement that none of those individual doubts expressed separately will remotely be sufficient to stop the juggernaut. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what the advocates of the FTAA, of the free trade area of the Americas, are hoping to create a juggernaut, or the impression of a juggernaut that no individual or collective efforts will be able to stop. When we look at what is happening in Quebec, we see two hands of the same pincer attack. Pressure coming from above, pressure from below. You see this, the people out in the streets rioting. You see the tear gas. Well, as we pointed out in the New American, many of these same leaders of the violent anti-FTAA demonstrations are also being led and funded and directed by the same Council on Foreign Relations, the Pratt House regulars. As we pointed out in our discussion of the WTO in Seattle, the group credited with most of the violence there was the Ruckus Society. The Ruckus Society was founded by Mike Roselle, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a radical greenie and co-founder of the eco-terrorist Earth First and the Rainforest Action Network. It is the Rainforest Action Network which is leading most of the anti-FTAA demonstrations. Why are they doing this? Obviously, the street demonstrators are making the insiders at the top look conservative, making them look reasonable, and helping to elicit sympathy for the alleged objectives of the free trade area of the Americas. One of those who helped lead that, the anti-WTO and anti-free trade effort, is David Brower. And he explained this whole process of making the radicals look more progressively more moderate. He said, the Sierra Club made the Nature Conservancy look reasonable. I founded the Friends of the Earth to make the Sierra Club look reasonable. Then I founded the Earth Island Institute to make the Friends of the Earth look reasonable. Earth First now makes us look reasonable. We're still waiting for someone to come along and make Earth First look reasonable. Well, he need wait no longer because, as he knows, Mike Roselle, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the Earth First founders, now is pushing the Ruckus Society and the Action Network, the Rainforest Action Network. Several days ago, the Council on Foreign Relations held a press briefing in Washington, D.C. One of the 5 one-worlders on their panel was John Kavanaugh, a director of the Institute for Policy Studies, the IPS. Many of you are familiar with the IPS. It is the hardcore center of Marxist activity with many direct links to Soviet KGB and Castro's DGI. They are operating right hand in hand with the Council on Foreign Relations. Also in that same boat is Ralph Nader and the woman who you will see put forward as Ralph Nader's chief lieutenant, Lori Wallach, whom we've written about in some detail in the New American Magazine. She again was one of those featured at the Millennium Summit and at the Gorbachev Summit this last September. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very clear that the effort which we are now seeing in the Summit of the Americas is an attempt to push forward the same thing which the same insiders fastened upon the peoples of Europe decades ago, and which is now coming to fruition with a very frightening culmination. And it is very clear that they intend the same thing for our country. A few days ago, I received a newsletter from a conservative organization lamenting these facts, but essentially throwing up their hands and saying that it is futile to work against this. They quoted a famous quote from James Russell Lowell. The quote is, "Truth forever on the gallows, wrong forever on the throne," is one we've all heard, and indeed, in this world, truth does seem to be forever on the gallows. But they then resigned their readers to hopeless frustration and defeatism. But there is another part to that quotation from Lowell. The full quote is, "Truth forever on the gallows, wrong forever on the throne. But that gallows sways the future, and behind the dim unknown, God is standing in the shadows, keeping watch above his own." God is above all things. God gives us strength. God gives us truth. God gives us the means and the will and the ability to fight for those things, to stand for the truth. And for the last 40 plus years, the John Birch Society has done just that. The current moves to create the free trade areas of America is part and parcel of the United Nations grasp for one world tyranny. And unless we rally to stop it and to inform our fellow Americans of exactly what is happening here in Quebec, and with all these subsidiary plans, they will triumph. So all of these come together under the John Birch Society's long-term plan, as we've said for many years, to get us out of the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the U.S. Thank you.